There are not many classic movies in black and white that America still watches year after year. It's a Wonderful Life rightly earns its place as one of the best Christmas movies of all time, and on some lists, the best movie of all time. It came out in 1946 and is still going strong. One thing that sets the movie apart is its very explicit message, as well as serious Christian themes. Now, let's just say its concept of angels is less than biblical, but it does draw on Christian faith to provide the backbone of films, so that's admirable. I'll resist doing an impersonation of him, but this movie stars Jimmy Stewart as George Bailey, a man fed up with life. After struggling his whole life, he has finally had it when he lost $8,000, which is going to be even more in today's money, and he's going to lose everything. He contemplates suicide, but an angel, Clarence, comes to stop him. Clarence shows George flashbacks of his life. He sees all the times George made a difference in the world, oftentimes at the cost of his own personal suffering. While he certainly had happy times, it seems misfortune is always right around the corner. Nevertheless, time after time, George chooses the harder path of selflessness over whatever he wants. He gives up his dreams to do what needs to be done for his family and for his city. After a review of his life, it comes to the point where George wishes he was never born. He interprets his life as a colossal failure. Instead of wishing he was dead, now he wishes he had never been born. Clarence shows him just that world that he wanted, what the world would be like if George Bailey never existed. It's a grim place. Without him around, the community suffered dramatically. Lives were lost and people lived miserable existences. Perhaps it's all a bit dramatic, but it all illustrates that the world needed George Bailey. Though he often got the short end of the stick, his selfish choices to stay and work in his community were meaningful. At the end of the movie, at the Christmas celebration, the whole city rallies around him and donates money to save his livelihood, just like he had saved them. George gets the message. He lives this message. The heartwarming tale shows what it's like to really invest in your community, to give up what you want for the sake of others. It inspires us to look around and see what we can do to help. You never know the positive ripple our actions will take in our family, our city, and perhaps even the whole world. So let's remember this. Every time you hear a bell ring, your selfless giving means everything.
There are three things we learn about George Bailey in the introduction to the movie It's a Wonderful Life. The first thing we learn right off the bat is that George is in trouble. He needs help. It took me roughly 30 seconds to tear up into this movie. The prayer from the little girl on behalf of her dad got me immediately, right? George is in trouble and there are lots of people praying for him. The second thing we learn about George is that he is a selfless, good guy. We learn about all of the ways that he has stepped in to help other people. He jumps in the icy pond to save his brother. He steps in when Mr. Gower puts the wrong pills in the bottle, and he keeps this other person from ingesting poison. He also defers and lets his younger brother go to college first. George is a good, selfless person. And the third thing we learn about George Bailey at the beginning of this movie is that he wants out of Bedford Falls. In fact, the first instance we see of him as a grown man is him trying to buy the biggest suitcase he can get a hold of. He has big dreams, he has big aspirations, and he wants to shake the dust of Bedford Falls off of his feet. These three truths about George Bailey are going to set the plot for the whole movie. And these three truths are also going to lead us to its resolution. I mean, the title of the movie should come with a spoiler alert. The truth is not subtle. And the truth is that George has a great, wonderful life right there in Bedford Falls. The idea that I'm going to challenge us with today is this: grow where you're planted, serve where you are, dance with the one that brought you, or as Jesus might say, love your neighbor. Stories from 1946 only last this long because they contain fundamental truths that still apply to our lives today. As I watched the resolution of this movie play out in the life of George Bailey, I picked out three truths for us. 3 moments that can help us come to the same conclusion that George comes to. 3 truths that can help us serve where we are and appreciate the blessings of our current situations. If you've ever spent any time around cattle, or for that matter, even just driven by a field that has cattle in it, you've probably witnessed this scenario. A cow with its neck outstretched, leaning through a barbed wire fence, chomping on grass on the other side of that fence. Now, we might be tempted to look at this situation and say things like, "Silly cow, don't you realize that you have acres of the same grass? Why risk sticking your neck through barbed wire to eat the grass on the other side?" Surely we, as intelligent human beings with our superior intellect, would never do something like that, right? False. We do that all the time. In fact, we use this situation with the cow to coin a phrase that takes place in our lives all the time. The grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. Now, there's nothing wrong with having hopes and dreams and big aspirations. There's nothing wrong with wanting more or wanting some other place to go. But that's not really what the saying is getting at. Watch this interaction here that happens with George and one of his old friends.
We just stopped in town to take a look at the new factory, and then we're going to drive on down to Florida.
Oh,
Why don't you have your friends join us?
Why, sure. Hey, why don't you kids drive down with us, huh?
Oh, I'm afraid I couldn't get away, Sam.
Still got the nose to the old grindstone, eh? Jane, I offered to let George in on the ground floor in plastics, and he turned me down cold.
Oh, now don't rub it in.
I'm not rubbing it in. Well, I guess we better run along.
Awfully happy to have met you, Mary. Nice
Goodbye.
meeting you. Bye,
Jane,
George.
glad to see
Come
you.
along, George. See you in the funny
Goodbye,
paper.
Sam.
Come on, Mary.
Sam. Have fun.
Thanks for dropping her out.
Florida. Hee-haw!
Hee-haw.
This is the danger, right? I mean, right before this, George and Mary had just helped Martini and his family into their new home. They're doing great things in Bedford Falls. And then George has a conversation with one of his old buddies, and it pulls his attention away from the good things that are happening right in front of him, and George begins to look longingly at places like Florida. All of a sudden, his life isn't so grand anymore. All of a sudden, his car is just a piece of junk. Comparison is the killer of contentment. Let me say that one again. Comparison is the killer of contentment. One of the most oft quoted passages in the Old Testament comes to us from Jeremiah 29:11. You can go into Mardel and find it on all sorts of things, on pictures and mugs and pillows probably too. Jeremiah 29:11 says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future." Pulling this quote out of context can lead us right into the problem that we're trying to address. It can pull us right into the mindset of staring at the other side of the fence. God tells us, or God tells the Israelites in this moment, that he has a plan for them, a prosperous future. He has good things in store for them. And we might read this and think, great, I'm in a place that I don't like so much right now. I'm not pumped about my current situation. And here comes God with this promise of a prosperous future. And so I'm just going to stare at that. I'm just going to focus on that at the expense of what's happening right here in front of me. The fascinating part about this promise is that it comes to God's people in exile. They are in a place that they don't want to be. Perfect, we might say. That lines up with exactly what I'm reading into this text. But wait just a second. Let's go back a few verses in Jeremiah 29 and begin in verse 4. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there. Do not decrease. Also, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. To this people in exile, God says, settle in. Make it better. Prosper your city. Invest in your city. Invest on this side of the fence. Which leads us right into the second truth. What do we invest in? Invest in people.
Now you take this loan here to Ernie Bishop. You know, that fellow that sits around all day on his brains in his taxi, you know. I happen to know the bank turned down this loan, but he comes here and we're building him a house worth $5,000. Why?
Well, I handled that, Mr. Potter. You have all the papers there, his salary, insurance. I can personally vouch for his character.
Friends of yours.
Yes, sir.
You see, if you shoot pool with some employee here, you can come and borrow money. What does that get us? A discontented, lazy rabble instead of a thrifty working class. And all because a few starry-eyed dreamers like Peter Bailey stir 'em up and fill their head with a lot of impossible ideas. Now, I say...
Just a minute. Now, hold on, Mr. Potter. Just a minute. Now, you're right when you say my father was no businessman. I know that. Why he ever started this cheap penny-ante building alone, I'll never know. But neither you nor anybody else can say anything against his character because his whole life was... Why, in the 25 years since he and Uncle Billy started this thing, he never once thought of himself. Isn't that right, Uncle Billy? He didn't save enough money to send Harry to school, let alone me. But he did help a few people get out of your slums, Mr. Potter. And what's wrong with that? Well, here, you're all businessmen here. Doesn't it make them better citizens? Doesn't it make them better customers? You said that what'd you say just a minute ago? They had to wait and save their money before they even thought of a decent home? Wait for what? Until their children grow up and leave them? Until they're so old and broken down that you know how long it takes a working man to save $5,000? Just remember this, Mr. Potter, that this rabble you're talking about, they do most of the working and paying and living and dying in this community. Well, is it too much to have them work and pay and live and die in a couple of decent rooms and a bath? Anyway, my father didn't think so. People were human beings to him, but to you, a warped, frustrated old man, they're cattle.
Jesus was a revolutionary for several reasons, but one of the biggest might be in the way that he treats and values people. Jesus blesses people that the world says probably shouldn't be blessed. Jesus calls his disciples from a group of people that the world would not call disciples from. Jesus invests in people. I keep coming back to the story of Zacchaeus these days. I can't get away from it. In Luke 19, Jesus enters Jericho. A tax collector, a pretty short tax collector, wants to see Jesus, so he climbs up in a tree. Now, Luke does this pretty incredible storytelling technique here. Luke wants us to look at two different ideas, two opposing ideas, and he wants us to look at them side by side. Listen to how he sets this up in Luke 19, beginning in verse 5. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, "He has gone to be the guest of a sinner." when common sense tells the people that there's nothing here worth investing in, Jesus does it anyway. When people like Potter say this loan makes no sense, Jesus lends anyway. And as Christians, we're called to follow his lead. Believe in the goodness of people. Choose to believe the best about people. Might we get burned a few times? Sure. Might someone take advantage of the generosity? Probably yes. But Luke has a message to send to us. Immediately after he sets up these two reactions side by side, listen to what happens next. But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost." Invest in your side of the fence. Invest in people. And truth number 3, invest recklessly.
I may lose a fortune, but I am willing to guarantee your people too. Just tell them to bring their shares over here, and I will pay 50 cents on the dollar.
Oh, you never miss a trick, do you, Potter? Well, you're going to miss this one.
If you close your doors before 6 p.m., you will never reopen.
George, was it a nice wedding? Gosh, I wanted to be there.
Yeah. You can take this one off now.
The building alone is in trouble. The easiest thing for George to do would be to agree to Potter's terms. But the easiest thing for George to do is not what's in the best interest for the people of Bedford Falls. And so what does George do? Give away his honeymoon money, all but the last dollar. Jesus teaches us something crazy in Mark chapter 12. A teacher of the law approaches him and asks, "What is the greatest commandment?" Jesus says, "Love God with all that you have and love your neighbor as yourself." What would I hope that someone would do for me if I found myself in a time of need? Deuteronomy 15 verses 7 through 8 say this way: "If anyone is poor among your fellow Israelites in any of the towns of the land that the Lord your God is giving you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted toward them. Rather, be open-handed and freely lend them whatever they need." Literally, George Bailey does this, right? He opens up his own hand and he looks at the people gathering around his desk and he says, "What is it that you need?" Now, George's investment pays off. In his moment of need, those people come back and return the money that he had lent to them earlier in the movie. But the money isn't the part that warms your heart and makes you cry at the end. It's the people. Inevitably, we will or have found ourselves in places like George Bailey. We'll begin to feel like life isn't so wonderful. We'll begin to peer at the grass on the other side of that fence and begin to feel pretty pessimistic about our current situation. So what do? Invest in our side of the fence. Invest in people. And invest recklessly. Go and be like Jesus. And for next week, watch How the Grinch Stole Christmas.